If you guys love Bad Day HQ, don't forget to check out Good Day HQ, available at youtube.com/gooddayhq. It features the best in reality television, travel shows, and just general fun stuff to bring a smile to your day.
In the years leading to World War II, the mighty ocean liners that crisscrossed the Atlantic represented technology at its most extraordinary. Many believed they were as close to perfection as human endeavor could come. But even with advanced expertise, we are still human beings prone to mistakes and misunderstandings that can lead to disaster and cause an ocean queen to bring death to those who have come to protect her. Friday morning, October 2nd, 1942. In the North Atlantic, off the coast of Ireland, seas are high, but the day is unusually clear. A Royal Navy convoy steams westward in search of the troop ship it has come to escort back to the United Kingdom. 6 destroyers are led by HMS Curacoa, a 4,200-ton cruiser first launched in 1917. Her skipper, Captain John Boutwood, is also in command of the convoy. A 25-year veteran, his promotion to captain is less than a year old.
On June the 2nd, 1942, I took command of HMS Curacoa, an old sea-class cruiser adapted for anti-aircraft work.
I know he was very happy when he was first given a sea-going ship. He was a man of action. He wanted to go places. He wanted to go. Hated desk jobs.
Curaçao was a standard World War I light cruiser, built primarily for operations in the North Sea, operating either with destroyers or with the battle fleet.
On the morning of October 2nd, 1942, Captain Boutwood is in command of 429 men on board the Curaçao, including 26 officers. Captain John Cole is in charge of the Royal Marine contingent on board. He is also an air defense officer in the ADP, the air defense platform high above the bridge, where he and his lookout crew are on morning watch. Cole has recently become engaged to a girl in Belfast, introduced to him by his friend, Sub-Lieutenant Patrick Holmes, who is due to relieve him on the ADP at noon. But it is John Cole's watch that first sights the troop ship they will be escorting back to port. It is the Queen Mary, easily recognizable despite her military gray veneer. Launched in 1936 by the Cunard White Star Line, the Queen Mary is an engineering marvel. Just 60 meters short of the Empire State Building, she has an outer and inner hull to help keep her watertight. With engines generating 200,000 horsepower, she is able to make a transatlantic crossing in 5 days with record speeds of 30 knots.
And bearing in mind that her weight, if she was on scales, is 80,000 tons, and driving that through rough seas, displacing 80,000 tons of water and doing it at 35 miles an hour is really something very special.
With the outbreak of war in 1939, the Queen Mary is drafted for military service. Designed to hold 2,000 passengers, she is modified to carry a full division of 15,000 American troops. The safety of the Super Troopers lies in their ability to outrun anything on the high seas, including the 350 German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic in the fall of 1942.
In the open ocean, they were perfectly safe from submarines. No submarine had the speed to get into an attacking position.
Because they travel alone, the liners follow a preset zigzag course to avoid torpedo fire. To aid the man at the wheel, a clock rings a signal bell for every change in course. The skipper of the Queen Mary, Captain Gordon Illingworth, has a preference for zigzag number 8, one he has used consistently since taking over the troop ship 3 months earlier.
He was regarded as one of the best captains in the line.
To further protect the ship, Illingworth has strict orders never to stop, no matter what the circumstance. Air Corpsman John Hendricks is just one of over 10,000 men on board the Queen Mary on October 2nd, 1942.
We had a stateroom for two. There was only 14 of us in the stateroom. So we didn't have much room to move around.
John Hendricks is on deck when he catches sight of the Royal Navy escort, necessary now that the liner is nearing the Irish coast.
If a liner came within range of enemy aircraft, then it might well be in danger. And so what you had to do was to work out a rather complicated choreography of escorts meeting, taking station, and almost having the liner sail through them as they tried to give as much escort as they possibly could in what was perceived as the danger zone.
Which is exactly what Captain John Boutwood intends to do this October Friday. He orders his destroyers to head for port, serving as a forward screen. He follows in a straight line ahead of the Queen Mary, as fast as his engines can muster. In the engine room, Chief Petty Officer Charles Coulson is one of the men responsible for maintaining the Curaçao's speed. Married in 1940, he has just recently become a father.
Well, he was always happy-go-lucky, and you know, he was having the best time of his life, and he was doing what he wanted to do.
On the Curaçao, Sub-Lieutenant Patrick Holmes and his team of lookouts relieve Marine Captain John Cole's crew on the air defense platform. As he says goodbye to Cole, Patrick Holmes cannot know that he will never see his friend again. 1:30 p.m. In the North Atlantic, the troopship Queen Mary continues her zigzag course. She is about a kilometer behind her escort cruiser, the HMS Curacao, and closing in. On the Queen Mary, the clock signals the next change in course. Watch Officer Noel Robinson gives the go-ahead, and the liner turns towards the Curacao. But Robinson is concerned. He feels that the escort cruiser is too close and orders the wheelman to hold the course change until it seems safe to continue. Junior First Officer James Wright arrives to relieve Robinson and decides he can safely complete the Queen Mary's change in course. But he too realizes that the cruiser is still dangerously close and orders a hard starboard turn away from the Curaçao. The emergency order brings Queen Mary Captain Gordon Illingworth to the bridge. He decides that the cruiser is not as close as his junior officers imagine, and orders Wright to resume the course change as before.
And perhaps it was at that moment that almost the fate of Curaçao was sealed, because he was actually saying, "Don't worry, the cruiser will always avoid us."
On the Curaçao, Captain John Boutwood is just as convinced that he has the right of way.
Captain Boutwood knew that, in fact, by the overtaking rules, the ship that was overtaking would take the evasive maneuver. And because Queen Mary was overtaking, he thought that she would be the one to sheer off if there was a danger of collision. So there is a chain of events on the bridge of Queen Mary, which you can see leading inadvertently, accidentally, to disaster.
Friday, October 2nd, 1942. By 2 p.m., the Queen Mary has almost caught up to the Curaçao. The liner has closed the gap as Captain Boutwood expected and will soon pass, allowing the Curaçao to move in behind. Some of the cruiser's off-duty crew gathers on deck for a look at the famous ocean liner. American GIs are doing the same on the Queen Mary, including John Hendricks and fellow serviceman Olin Medley, who brings his camera. Most have never seen a Royal Navy ship before. It is 2:08 p.m. On the Queen Mary, Watch Officer James Wright can see that the cruiser is very close. He is comforted by his captain's assurance that the escort will keep out of the way. 2:10 p.m. On the Queen Mary, as Watch Officer Noel Robinson returns to the deck to relieve his counterpart James Wright, Captain Illingworth calls Wright to the chart room next door. In quickly passing the watch to Robinson, Wright makes no mention of the close proximity of the escort cruiser.
The Queen Mary did a right-hand zigzag, but by this time the Curacoa had fallen behind, and as the Queen Mary went out, she realized she was on a straight collision course for the Curacoa.
First Officer Robinson immediately orders evasive action, but it is much too late.
You've got to realize a ship that's displacing 80,000 tons of water and is something like 300 meters long and is going at 28 knots. There's nothing one can do. The die is cast. You can't get out of the situation.
From his perch in the ADP, Patrick Holmes sees the Queen Mary bearing down like a giant guillotine. On the deck below, some of the Curaçao crew is already diving overboard. Unaware of what is happening, Chief Petty Officer Charlie Collinson and several shipmates come up from the engine room below.
He had come on top deck to get some air, and he was buttoning up his coat. He said that he just looked up, and there, right in his face, was the bow of the Queen Mary, and it kind of took his breath away.
On the Queen Mary, the ship clock signals the next change in course. It is exactly 2:12 p.m.
Curaçao came from the starboard side, the right-hand side of Queen Mary, under her bows. And Queen Mary struck her about 2/3 of the way down, cutting off her stern. And the two parts of the ship foundered almost immediately.
Chief Petty Officer Charlie Collinson is thrown back by the impact and knocked unconscious into the cold Atlantic. As Patrick Holmes urges his men into their life jackets, he thinks he sees a German U-boat disappearing into the sea, until he realizes it is the stern of his own ship, already sinking a half-kilometer away. Those on board the Queen Mary barely feel more than a slight jarring, like a rowboat hitting a log. Many of the GIs throw their own life belts overboard, as others urge Olin Medley to take a picture before it is too late.
And he wasn't supposed to have a camera on board, so he was reluctant, and we all opened our top coats and shielded him so he could take a picture of it. So that, I'm sure, I know the only picture that I have ever seen that's available was a picture that Olin Medley took.
From inside the front section of the stricken cruiser, men clamber into the flooded main deck, waves crashing around them. Wireless operator Jeffrey Carter is among those who scramble down the side of the listing ship and jump into the water.
He knew that there was going to be oil on top, so he was going to swim as long as he possibly could underwater. And he said, finally, he felt like his lungs were going to burst while he came to the surface, and he was out beyond the oil.
As the Curaçao begins to sink, Captain John Boutwood stays with his ship as long as he can.
Of course, I was alone there, and as the water sort of bubbled up all round, I more or less stepped into the sea and immediately went down with the last remaining bit of the ship.
On the Queen Mary, Captain Gordon Illingworth can see the magnitude of the disaster, but is powerless to help.
There was no question of Queen Mary stopping, quite rightly. To risk 10,000 American soldiers to pick up a few hundred British sailors was, unfortunately, in the grim logic of war, not an acceptable trade-off.
He reduced speed immediately, but fortunately the way the damage had been done, the ship was not making a lot of water, and quickly he increased speed and went to the Clyde in safety.
Captain Illingworth sends a message to the convoy destroyers 2 hours ahead to return and carry out rescue operations. He can only hope it is not too late. Friday, October 2nd, 1942. In the North Atlantic, the Royal Navy cruiser Curaçao has found its final resting place at the bottom of the sea. Within minutes of colliding with the giant troop ship Queen Mary, many of those who sailed her have gone down with the ship. Those fortunate enough to be alive must now survive a cold Atlantic swell coated with congealing fuel oil. One of them is Chief Petty Officer Charles Coulson, who wakes up floating in the frigid water. The last thing he remembers is trying to button his coat just before the collision.
And a piece of debris from the boat had somehow got caught between the buttons and was actually keeping him afloat. He can basically thank a piece of debris for saving his life. And all around him were people screaming and crying out for help and clinging onto wreckage, whatever they could cling on to, I guess, to survive.
Floating debris is everywhere, coated with fuel oil. Patrick Holmes finds a rolled-up float-a-net, a large rope mesh life-saving device supported by cork floats. Unable to open it, he hangs on as best he can. Athletic and a strong swimmer, Charlie Coulson tries to save several of his mates struggling around him.
Unfortunately, he had to watch some of his friends drown, especially a gentleman that had been at Uncle Charlie's wedding. And I guess it was just a case of fighting for your life and survival at that point in time.
I think that's what was devastating to him, not necessarily what happened to him, but his experience of the surroundings around him.
It is 2 long hours before 3 of the convoy destroyers arrive to help. One of the oil-soaked survivors is Curaçao Captain John Boutwood. Of the 27 officers aboard the cruiser, only he and Patrick Holmes have survived. 28 Royal Marines are also dead, including Patrick Holmes' friend, Captain John Cole. Survivor Jeffrey Carter recalls a sense of elation after his rescue, a feeling quickly dulled by the sight of those who didn't make it.
A lot of those survivors, according to Jeff Carter, had breathed in oil, and there was no way they were going to clear that out of their lungs. So apparently a lot of the guys, even though they were picked up by the standby ships, still died from their lungs being flooded with oil.
Of the 430 men aboard the Curaçao that fateful October afternoon, 338 have perished, most within minutes of the collision.
I don't think any of us really realized how many people was on the Curaçao. It looked like such a small ship compared to the Queen Mary that I just never thought about a lot of people being on it.
For security reasons, the tragedy is not made public until the end of the war in Europe in 1945. Almost immediately, the British Admiralty takes the Cunard White Star Line to court for the loss of the Curaçao. The case before the High Court Justice lasts a year and a half, and eventually concludes that both captains believed they had the right of way.
It was then found that the Admiralty were 2/3 to blame and Cunard 1/3 to blame. Now this was a victory in its own way. Those who had lost beloved ones could then go to take civil action because of the suffering and loss that they had sustained.
The immediate consequence of the Curaçao tragedy is a change in Navy policy regarding protection of the Super Troopers.
They stopped escorting the big liners at all.
For the survivors of the disaster, life is a blessing, but never quite the same. Many suffer nightmares for years afterward. Charlie Coulson remains a Navy man until his retirement, but the events of October 2nd, 1942 forever shape his life.
He became what I call sort of like a scared man. He was not a risk taker. So he lost that sort of spontaneity that he had when he was a younger man.
The two ship captains fare much better, both continuing their naval careers throughout the war and afterward.
Illingworth went on to be Commodore of the Cunard White Star Line. He was considered to have been a successful commanding officer of Queen Mary. Captain Boutwood got a new command of minesweepers in the Mediterranean and came out of the war as quite a distinguished officer.
Apart from giving my testimony at the Admiralty's Board of Inquiry, and again in the law courts a long time later, I have never made any personal comments on the cause of the disaster. I am not going to break that rule now, other than to say that no sense of guilt or shame has ever given me a sleepless moment.
It is not until the early 1990s that surviving crew of the Curacao gather for the first time to mark a tragedy that by then is largely forgotten.
It was, in a sense, a byway of the Second World War. If you go on board the Queen Mary, there is a display which tells the story, but it isn't something that is in the forefront of people's minds.
It was a horrible thing. It's a part of history, and nobody's going to change it. You have to realize that war is war, and lives are lost, and you live and enjoy what you can while you can, and that's about the whole thing in a nutshell.
If you guys are preparing for the apocalypse or want to survive a disaster or just want to have a really awesome camping trip, check out the products we have in the links below. Just by shopping for these products, you help support Bad Day HQ. In fact, any shopping you do in Amazon while going through these links will actually help us produce more great content for you guys.